Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's special COVID-19 webinar hosted by the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. We thank you for joining us today and appreciate all you're doing to help children during this challenging time. As COVID-19 and the resulting global lockdown grips the world, another silent crisis is emerging: the increased threat to child rights and children who are most vulnerable. In the past months, with nearly all of the world's children out of school and families facing social isolation, disrupted work, financial struggles, and resource insecurity, the resulting stress has amplified the risk of violence in the home. In this webinar, Drs. Ashley Stewart-Tefescu and Joan Durant from the University of Manitoba will present a child rights-based framework for parenting, describe a parenting program based on these principles, and share some resources for rights-based parenting. Right now, I have everyone on mute to avoid background noise. We welcome you to enter your questions and comments in the questions box throughout the presentation. The presenters will answer questions at the end as time permits. Dr. Joan Durant is a professor of community health sciences in the College of Medicine at the University of Manitoba in Canada. For 30 years, her research has focused on understanding the drivers and impacts of punitive violence against children. She co-authored the Joint Statement on Physical Punishment of Children and Youth, endorsed by more than 650 professional organizations in Canada, and was a member of the Research Advisory Committee of the United Nations Secretary General's Study on Violence Against Children. She has published and co-edited many academic articles and books on corporal punishment and its prohibition. In collaboration with Save the Children Sweden, Joan created Positive Discipline in Everyday Parenting, a violence prevention program founded on children's rights, which has been implemented in more than 30 countries around the world. Dr. Ashley Stewart-Tefescu is a registered social worker and research fellow in the Departments of Community Health Sciences and Psychiatry in the Max Rady College of Medicine at the University of Manitoba. She currently holds the Postdoctoral Health Research Fellowship at the Children's Hospital Research Institute of Manitoba. Ashley's research focuses on global child protection and adverse childhood experiences, including the development, implementation, and evaluation of child maltreatment prevention and early intervention strategies in diverse and under-resourced countries across Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Joan and Ashley, we thank you so much for being with us today and for your contributions to child protection. Now I will turn it over to Ashley.
Great. Heather, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, it looks good. Thank you.
Great. And you're able to hear me well?
Yes.
Fantastic. So good morning, everyone, or good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you to Heather and IFSCAN for providing Dr. Durant and myself with this really wonderful opportunity to connect with such a large and diverse group of child-serving professionals and advocates from all over the world during this really unprecedented time. So before I begin, I want to welcome everyone into my home where I'm speaking from this morning in Winnipeg, Canada. And with that in mind, I want to warn you that you may hear some sounds of a busy family home. I have asked my children to hold off on asking for any homework help until the end of the webinar. And I've also asked the dog to refrain from barking at the mail carrier this morning, but there are no guarantees. So my sincere apologies in advance for any interruptions. So as Heather mentioned, this webinar is going to focus specifically on child rights and parenting during this global pandemic. So just as an overview for the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to begin the presentation by discussing some parenting challenges as a result of COVID-19, and then I'm going to introduce you to a child rights framework for parenting. Then I'm going to be turning the presentation over to Dr. Durant, and she's going to be describing a particular parenting approach that really operationalizes these child rights principles in the context of discipline. And really, it's useful in any situation, but it's especially important as we navigate parenting during a pandemic and as well post-pandemic. And then we're hoping we'll leave some time at the end of our presentation for any questions you may have. So as we all know, parenting at the best of times can be challenging. While there are many joyful moments to be celebrated, all parents and ultimately children benefit when caregivers have access to supportive, compassionate, and caring networks. And while this network may differ depending on our individual circumstances, for example, where we live, from a socio-ecological framework or perspective, this network of ours might include extended families, so it might be grandparents, aunts, uncles, and neighbors. It might involve the school system, so our children's teachers and other educators and support staff that exist within that sphere. Our parenting network may also include childcare providers, formal and informal babysitters that provide parents with care so that they may be able to work outside of the home. Our network may also include resources within our communities. So this might be religious institutions, places of worship, or community centers. And another important example of a component of our caregiving network may be the access to extracurricular activities and programs, play structures, green spaces, and open spaces in our immediate environment for our children to play safely and to explore. And lastly, this caregiving network, or this parenting village, if you will, may also include friendships and close connections and relationships with other caregivers and parents. So taken together in various forms, it's really these resources and supports that make up our own personal network of parenting supports, which is crucial not only for healthy development, but for also strengthening families and promoting mental and physical health and well-being within a family. And unfortunately, as we all know, a few months ago now, it may seem like a year ago for many of us, a global pandemic overtook our world. And as a result, this has really dramatically impacted our ability to access our individual caregiving networks. So for example, due to physical distancing requirements and social isolation for those perhaps at heightened risk of becoming infected by the virus, like grandparents, for example, we're no longer able to access those supports. As well, we know that over 90% of the world's children have been impacted by school closure. Many parents are no longer able to work outside of the home because of lack of access to childcare. Our community centers and our play structures have been closed or inaccessible, and caregivers are no longer able to support each other in person in the ways that we were previously accustomed to. So in addition to losing access to these essential caregiving networks, parents are experiencing tremendous stressors. So as we know, families are required to physically distance, quarantine, and shelter in place. And for many families, this is in inadequate housing. COVID-19 has led to an increase in resource insecurity and hoarding behaviors. So in Canada, what we were struck by was that toilet paper hoarding became a serious source of stress for many families. Additional challenges for families also included job insecurity and unemployment. For families who were able to remain employed, there was the stress of transitioning to working from home in an environment which was never set up or intended to do so. So we're facing connectivity issues, concerns about maintaining access, and also concerns about maintaining productivity while working from home. And as well, for many families working from home, they're also having to contend with homeschooling their children and ensuring that their children are still getting adequate education with varying degrees of support from the formal education system. COVID-19 has also increased domestic violence, and this has been indicated by increased reports to crisis lines and women's shelters. And there's also been an increase in mental health concerns as a direct result of COVID-19, in particular depression and anxiety. And so to date, nearly 5.5 million individuals worldwide have contracted the virus, and clearly this is a medical and public health crisis. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has also initiated a somewhat hidden social and humanitarian crisis of grave proportions. And this has really resulted in serious consequences that will continue to challenge us for years to come beyond this current pandemic. And one of the most urgent and hidden challenges of this crisis is violence against children in the home setting. In recognition of this urgent child rights crisis, the United Nations, governments, and civil society organizations have called for increased protection for children and their rights during this pandemic. Notably, the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children calls on governments and the international community and leaders in every sector to urgently respond with a united effort to protect children against the heightened risk of violence, exploitation, and abuse as part of a broader global response to COVID-19. And similarly, the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has called on all states to consider not only the health, but also the social, educational, economic, and recreational impacts that this pandemic has on the rights of children, and really pointing out and recognizing that confinement and social isolation may indeed expose children to increased risks of physical and psychological violence in the home setting. So the question becomes, how big is this problem? And to really put the scope of this crisis into context, prior to the global pandemic, it was estimated that in the majority of the world's countries and territories, more than 2 in 3 children were subjected to violent discipline by their caregivers in the home environment. And this was prior to COVID-19. And in this case, violent discipline was defined as psychological aggression, so referring to actions of shouting, yelling, or screaming at the child, as well as humiliating the child and calling the child offensive names such as dumb or lazy. So it was a psychological aggression as well as physical punishment, so defined as shaking the child, hitting or slapping the child, or hitting the child with a hard object. So this is really prior to COVID-19, this was already an urgent crisis of great proportion. We know from recent research that's just been published that punitive violence has increased during the pandemic. So since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic a few months ago, parents have self-reported an increase in more conflict with their children. Parents have also reported an increase in yelling and screaming, using more harsh words towards their children, and spanking and hitting more often. Furthermore, looking at a particular 2-week period during the pandemic, over 20% of parents reported spanking or slapping their children at least once in a 2-week period. 61% of parents reported shouting, yelling, or screaming at their children at least one time during this 2-week period. 62% of parents reported taking away things of value from their children as punishment. And 58% of parents self-reported imposing isolation on their children in response to frustrating behavior. So an example of a forced isolation or imposed isolation might be something like a timeout. So as we mentioned earlier, one reason that may explain the increase in punitive violence during this pandemic, of course, is the increase in caregiver stress that's mentioned earlier. So it's this idea of employment, housing, and food insecurity, increased responsibilities, so homeschooling, providing education to our children, having to work from home and maintain productivity. It has to do with overcrowding and confinement, and also the requirement to confine children. This has been noted as particularly challenging for parents with adolescents who want to be out in the communities. They don't want to stay at home and they want to be engaging with their friends. Another source of stress for caregivers is, of course, uncertainty. So not knowing when this pandemic is going to end, or not knowing when and if there will be a second wave. And then as well, caregiver stress is related to loss of privacy, independence, and of course, access to those parenting networks we that I discussed earlier. So it's this idea of that parents and caregivers are experiencing a tremendous increase in stress right now. And this is coupled with pre-existing beliefs that discipline equals punishment. So it's together this notion of parental stress combined with parental beliefs about discipline and punishment that really puts children at increased risk of violence in the home setting. So to better understand this, to sort of unpack this caregiver beliefs related to discipline, I think it's useful if you'll allow me to just take a moment here to briefly kind of look at the historical perspectives or evolution of discipline. So historically, discipline was associated with pain and hurt. And throughout the 20th century, this began to shift somewhat, and discipline was then equated more with training the child and associated or related to behavioralism. And again, we're seeing a shift now towards this idea of discipline is more about mentoring the child. It's a relationship between the parent and the child that's intentional, wise, and it involves both the child and the parent as active participants. So if we take a look at the idea of discipline through hurt and pain, it was the idea that people learned through pain and suffering, and children most of all learned through this approach. And that's why we saw things like hitting, threatening, yelling, or humiliating the child in response to bad behavior or misbehavior. And that again is the perception of the parent deeming the behavior as bad or naughty, for example. As we transition to this idea of discipline through training, the idea here, the mechanism was that children learn through externally imposed consequences. So these may be consequences other than physical forms of punishment, such as shame and separation-based punishment, again, in response to behavior deemed as misbehavior or naughty behavior from the perspective of the parent. And this approach to discipline really looked at behavioral training. So it was focusing on what could be observed, so the child's behavior, but it wasn't considering what were the sort of the feelings and the thought that the child was trying to express through their behavior. And rewards and punishments were used to sort of shape the child's behavior to the behavior that the parent deemed acceptable, with the idea of shaping the child's behavior through rewards and punishments would lead to increased child compliance. And so the mechanism underlying behavioral training was really about discipline through disempowerment. So parents would use things like exclusion, shaming, or intentionally ignoring the child. Separation-based punishment, so things like isolating the child and putting them in a space, in a place to be secluded, or taking away items of value that the child loved. So this behavioral approach to discipline was really about discipline through disempowerment. So disempowering the child and empowering the parent. In contrast is discipline through mentoring. And discipline through mentoring really, as I said, is about seeing children as active participants in their learning. And it's about connecting, collaborating, scaffolding, and modeling the behavior that you look to see. And it's this discipline through mentoring that's really consistent with child rights principles. So if we see here, just to juxtapose the two approaches very briefly, discipline through training really focuses on the behavior, whereas a mentoring approach to discipline focuses on what are the internal processes that are actually driving the child's behavior. What are the feelings and thoughts that are being reflected by the child's behavior? As well, from a discipline as training perspective, it's that the behavior is defined by the parent as appropriate or inappropriate, as compliant or non-compliant. as opposed to a mentoring approach to discipline, which is really about understanding the behavior as reflecting a child's innate drive to construct knowledge, to gain an understanding of their environment and experiences, and to express their individuality. As I mentioned, discipline that's focused on training is about shaping the child's behavior through rewards and punishment to increase compliance, as opposed to a mentoring approach that really provides a safe space and environment for children to explore, to experiment, and to express their feelings and frustrations without fear of punishment or ridicule. And lastly, the difference here is really that one is an adult-centric perspective, so seeing the situation only from the adult perspective, as opposed to considering the experience and the situation from the child's perspective, so through the lens of a child. So in order to make this transformation from punitive responses to parenting to discipline, it really requires more than just simply replacing physical punishments with other emotional forms of punishment. It really requires a shift in our perspective or a shift in our lens to see the child as rather than just a passive object, but as a child who has agency. And from a parent as really shifting the perspective so that the parent's not just the punisher, but the parent is the mentor. So in order to really shift from this perspective of seeing discipline as punishment, but really seeing discipline as mentorship, requires a shift in our perspective. It requires a shift in the lens from seeing the child as a passive object to someone with agency, and a parent from a punisher to someone who mentors the child and guides the child. So discipline from a mentoring perspective is really based on 5 sort of core principles of rights respecting discipline. And these principles stem from the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I'm just going to briefly walk you through these 5 principles. And then Joan's going to discuss how to operationalize these principles in the context of parent-child relationships and discipline during this pandemic. So the first principle is really the idea that discipline must never be violent. It is non-violent both physically and emotionally. Article 19 of the CRC sets out the minimum standard that states that children must be protected from all forms of physical and mental violence. So any actions that are that hurt, shame, degrade, or frighten children cannot be acts of discipline. They're really acts of punitive violence. In order to, even as adults, in order to learn or to process, to build these healthy neural components, children and adults alike need to feel physically and emotionally safe and secure with their teachers and their mentors. So in this case, the mentors are us as the parents and primary caregivers. The second principle of a rights respecting approach to discipline is that discipline respects children's evolving capacities. So effective monitoring and learning are based on knowledge of developmental processes. And I'm not meaning like merely knowledge of milestones, for example, but really an understanding of the innate drive that children have for mastery and autonomy that underlies their development. And it's these innate and developmentally expected processes that underlie so much of what is often misinterpreted as misbehavior or naughty behavior or bad behavior. So attempts to control them through punishment, physical or emotional forms of punishment, can actually hinder the growth of autonomy and impair children's mental health. So really, a child rights approach to discipline begins by respecting the complex processes driving children's innate developmental processes. The third principle of a rights respecting approach to discipline is really that discipline respects children's individuality. The CRC states that the education of the child shall be directed to the development of the child's personality, their talents and mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential. So Article 29. And we know that prescriptive punishments, so things like timeouts or taking away things of value to the child, like their favorite stuffed animal, or taking away the cell phone, for example, are assumed to work regardless of the child's temperament or level of understanding. And they also inhibit growth, creativity, and construction of knowledge because what they do is they inhibit the child's willingness to take risks or to try and do things in novel ways. And it's related to fear. So as we all know, fear is a major reason why children might hesitate to express their ideas, perhaps especially some unconventional ones. And so it's this fear of failure, fear of exposing one's limitations, and fear of ridicule that are actually very powerful deterrents to creative thinking and exploration, the very things we want to encourage in our children. The fourth principle of rights respecting discipline is that discipline fosters children's participation. So discipline that would be defined as punishment, so physical or otherwise emotional, assumes that children are not agents in their own learning. And it also places the balance of power to interpret children's behavior solely in the hands of the adult, and then to punish without regard for the child's perspective. So if we view discipline from a rights perspective, what we do is we view children as having personhood and having agency. And when we do that, it really leads us down a very different path towards discipline. It's now, we look at children as engaging them in problem solving and supporting their learning through cooperative rather than power-oriented relationships between parents and children. And the fifth principle of a rights respecting approach to discipline is that it respects children's dignity. Many punishments that are designed or administered are often called positive alternatives to hitting. So things like isolation, taking away belongings, or forcing children to stand or sit on chairs really does strip children of their agency and dignity. So a true rights respecting alternative vision teaches children while respecting their humanity and upholding their right to dignity. So with that in mind, with an overview of sort of the foundation and the core principles of a rights respecting approach to discipline, and having a perspective of what discipline through mentoring looks like, I'm now going to turn the presentation over to Dr. Durant, who's going to lead us through an approach that actually operationalizes these principles in the context of parenting.
Thank you, Ashley. I just want to be sure that I'm unmuted and my screen is visible.
Yes, it looks good.
Okay, thank you, Heather. So Ashley has laid out a rationale for shifting our views of discipline from punitive kinds of approaches to a child rights-based mentorship style of approach. But what we find is that many people wonder, what does this actually look like in real life? So I'm going to describe an approach based on child rights principles that I developed some years ago in collaboration with Save the Children. It's called positive discipline in everyday parenting because it helps parents deal with those many everyday situations that so often lead to punitive violence in homes all over the world. I just want to make one brief note, which is that I'm going to refer to all caregivers as parents, just for brevity and efficiency. But when I use the term parents, that includes extended family, kinship, foster care, all kinds of situations where adults are caring for children. So the objective of positive discipline in everyday parenting, or PDEP, is to gradually transform parents' understanding of their role. And so what we're trying to do is help them shift from thinking of their role as one of controlling children and their behavior through coercion and punishment to one of mentorship, through scaffolding their children's learning and collaborating with children, engaging their children's participation in their learning and in problem solving. And so the way that we do this is by increasing parents' capacities in a number of ways. First of all, we explicitly address child rights principles in this approach. So parents come to understand the concepts of children's rights to provision, participation, and protection. And that becomes something quite real to them. And we do this in ways that really help them to understand it at a deep level, not just as kind of an intellectual concept. We also take parents through the trajectory of development from birth right through adolescence. And we consider it very important to help parents understand how their relationships with their children have developed to this point, why things might have unfolded as they have that have led to perhaps a high level of conflict in the home. And we also want them to understand the pathway that they're on into the future so that they can see where their choice points are and where the forks are in this road that could lead to various kinds of outcomes. So when, I should just mention too, as Ashley said, that we don't look at development as a series of milestones or ages and stages kind of approach, but really the underlying themes of development that really are the heart of the many conflicts that parents experience with children. For example, the conflict that children are constantly feeling between the need to attach and to be close and the need to separate simultaneously. The need to rely on parental assistance and support and the need for autonomy. These things are often what's underlying the conflicts that emerge between parents and children. And if we only look at the surface behavior, we might perceive it as bad. But what's actually going on is a very human internal struggle within the child that can't yet be expressed. So when parents understand more about this and how children's emotional and social understandings develop, they come to see their children's behavior in new ways. So rather than simply viewing behavior as good or bad, they come to understand the feelings and the thoughts behind the behavior. And they also come to respect the fact that children have their own perspectives on situations that are just as valid as their own. They also come to understand the impact of their own actions on their children's feelings and behavior, and on the long-term development of their relationships with their children. And over time, they come to see discipline not as punishment, but as problem solving, as conflict resolution, and as a collaborative endeavor with their children. And so as they become increasingly motivated to approach discipline in this way, they also become very conscious of their own difficulties in self-regulation. So what often happens in a conflict situation is that the parent responds out of emotional arousal, out of the fight, flight, freeze response that's going on in their own brain. And once they can come to understand that, they then can become much more conscious of their arousal levels and implement self-regulation strategies that help them think their way through. So I'm going to tell you more concretely how we do this shortly, but I just want to mention a couple of things about this approach. It has developed into a not-for-profit program that has been implemented in 40 countries. And so what this means is that we are working in a wide variety of contexts. And these range from major cities to conflict zones, disaster zones, and remote villages. We work with newcomers, people who have come through migration to various places. Just really, we work around the world, so we work in a very, very highly diverse group of countries. And that requires that we understand these contexts and adapt our delivery and training accordingly. And we devote quite a bit of time and thought to that process. I should mention that Ashley, for example, has worked in Gaza and the West Bank, in the post-earthquake zones of Japan, and in remote villages of Indonesia, just as examples of that. Sorry, somebody's operating my slides here. We also spend a lot of time ensuring that translation is accurate and that it captures the nuances of the concepts that we're communicating. And to date, the program has been fully translated into the languages that you see here. So what is it that we actually try to help parents understand? Well, over 8 weeks, we take them through a framework or model that builds their knowledge, insight, empathy, problem-solving skills, and self-regulation skills. And I'm going to take you briefly through that model now. First of all, one of the reasons that punishment is so common around the world is that parents' attention, energy, and emotions become focused on getting children to comply in the immediate moment. And Ashley has addressed this to a good extent. This focus on control and compliance is really deeply entrenched in cultures around the world. It's not universal and is not historically universal, but it's certainly highly prevalent around the world. And this focus on control and compliance leads us as parents very quickly to a punitive solution, because punishment gives us that sense of control. And it can also be a highly impulsive act when we hear that message in our heads that the child must comply. So the first thing that we focus on is shifting parents' attention to their long-term goals. What we found around the world over and over again is that parents' actual goals are not compliance and submission. They are to foster nonviolence and empathy and respect for others and honesty and kindness and mental health in their children. And they quickly realize, once they start really thinking about this, that hitting, yelling, threatening, punishing, isolating, removing things from children actually interfere with reaching these goals, because they are embedded in power. And that is actually teaching children. I don't know why my screen is operating on its own, but I apologize if there's a bit of jerkiness here. Something is happening out there and it's advancing my screen. So by focusing on what they actually really want to teach their children over the long term, they begin to inhibit that impulse to punish. But then what do they do instead? And that, of course, is the big question. What we help parents understand is that they have two very, very important tools that are very handy to them. The first is what we call providing warmth. And warmth is really creating a climate in the home that is safe and secure, so that children are not in a state of anxiety or fear, whether it's fear that something they love is going to be taken from them arbitrarily, or whether it's fear that they're going to be separated from the parent, or whether it's fear that they're going to be hit or yelled at. That fear, that sense of threat really can pervade their consciousness, and it makes it very difficult for them to learn. It also encourages them to behave out of a motivation to avoid punishment, as opposed to really learning and understanding and internalizing their parents' values and standards and rationales. So warmth is really unconditional love and acceptance and a climate of safety. Together with that, at all times in equal measure, the other tool needs to be implemented, which is what we call structure. And structure is not punishment. It's not about control or coercion in any way. Structure is about what Lev Vygotsky called scaffolding, which means building on the child's current knowledge to help them move to the next level of understanding. So, for example, rather than asking or expecting a child of 2 to sit still for 15 minutes and then punishing them when they can't, structure would build supports in for the child, would recognize the child's developmental understanding, their self-regulation capacity, their need for activity, and it would build in supports to help the child gradually gain that ability to sit still. Again, apologies for my autonomous screen. The ways that we provide warmth and structure, though, can be different depending on the child's development. So the next thing that we help parents understand, as Ashley and I have already mentioned, is how children actually think and feel. How does development take place over childhood and adolescence? How does the brain develop? How does self-regulation develop? How does the child's understanding of their own emotions develop? How do their social interactions change? How do their understandings of relationship change? How does their ability to take the perspective of another person gradually develop? And at this time, of course, we need to understand this in particularly in relation to the current context. So in the COVID-19 context, we need to understand not only what might be typical across the developmental pathway, but how that might be manifesting itself now in this situation of heightened stress. So what we would want to do in this context is to help parents understand how children's stress is reflected in their behavior. There is one more building block to the model, but I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on children's thoughts and feelings here to relate it more concretely to the COVID-19 context. So if we think about this developmentally, we might start by thinking about the stresses that young children are experiencing, particularly right now. And one of the things that they're feeling, or many of them anyway, is greater frustration. Their opportunities to play with other children have become very restricted. And this is contrary to the natural course of development. Children need to, I'm sorry, I'm on slideshow mode. Okay, thank you. Their capacity to get out and play and exercise their social relationships and their social skills and feed and nurture their social relationships has been terribly restricted, and that leads to considerable frustration in young children. They're also missing the people around them that they normally interact with. They're the people who care for them, the people who might teach them, their extended family. And they also, at a young age, have difficulty identifying, naming, and expressing their emotions in ways that adults have learned to do over many years. So what these things are doing is creating a greater likelihood of emotional outbursts in children. If all we do is punish those outbursts, we're not addressing what's actually going on within the child. And what we're doing is really leading them to feel misunderstood, although they can't name that. They're feeling unjustly treated, but they can't name that. And they're feeling really disempowered because they're not being heard. We aren't taking the time to understand what's going on inside of them that might be leading to this kind of behavior. They also might be feeling greater fear. Young children don't have a concept of viruses or illness or death. And of course, that's the talk all around them all the time. They don't know what it means. They have no scale to measure this on. They have no reference points. They've only been on the planet for a very few years, and adults are having a hard time understanding all of this. So young children are very prone to becoming fearful of things they don't understand, as are we all. And this fear might manifest itself as a need to be with their parents all the time, as a need for more touching, for a clinging kind of behavior. It might also show itself in sleep disturbances, nightmares, or bedwetting. And of course, these things are all in parents' minds often perceived as bad behavior and as meriting of punishment, when really what parents are doing when they punish this behavior is punishing the child's expression of fear, which of course impairs their growing capacities to understand and express their emotions in healthy ways. So with structure, what we would do is scaffold the child's learning. We would help them to understand what they're feeling inside and help them learn ways of coping and managing and maintaining their optimism and finding ways of overcoming, transcending, mastering all those things that they're driven to do and that we can help them do if we don't punish these feelings out of them. In school-age children, we are seeing a lot of sadness and grief for what's been lost, the disruptions in their social lives, the loss of their teachers, their friends at school, their extended family members. Children are missing very important events right now. We're trying to figure out how to celebrate graduation for high school students here in Canada, and other celebrations around the world. We've just seen Ramadan be really transformed, and all of those things create a sense of loss for adults, and very much so for children. And those feelings might be manifested in crying or anger or, again, emotional outbursts. Some children may be spending increased time on social media just to fill that gap, to maintain that sense of connection. And of course, these kinds of behaviors are often punished. They're considered bad behaviors that need to be eliminated. But if we see them as representations, reflections of emotions, we approach them very differently, and we help, again, children understand their emotions and come to be able to cope with these stresses. Children this age are also feeling a lot of frustration from physical distancing requirements and from online or homeschooling. It's very difficult for some children to see their parents as also their teachers. It's very difficult for them to shift in that relationship between having to sit and do their math as opposed to having that parental relationship that they're used to. This creates confusion and difficulty for them. In some cases, children don't have access to the internet, so they have even greater separation from their social worlds. And this frustration can be manifested as difficulty concentrating, a hard time staying motivated, not sitting down and doing their homework when they're supposed to. They're frustrated, and they don't have a way to let that out if we punish it. So we can see it again in crying, anger, outbursts of emotion. They also are experiencing fear from this virus. We can't get around that. We're all scared. All of our behavior right now is being governed by fear. And so we're trying to be rational about it, but when it comes down to it, we are afraid. And our children are picking all of that up. They're seeing the separations from grandparents and from others, and they have to understand that that's because those people could get very, very sick and die. So that fear becomes very intense in some cases, and that might be manifested in not wanting to eat, or not wanting to go to bed, or changes in their moods. And again, we perceive that as bad behavior, misbehavior, we're going to approach it in a way that actually impairs the child's emotional development, emotional literacy, and capacity for resilience. In older children, and I'll just speed up a little here because I think you're getting the point, they're experiencing a lot of sadness and grief as well due to the disruptions and disconnections. They also have lost the predictability in their worlds. They're feeling a tremendous amount of uncertainty. In some places, they don't know if they'll be able to have jobs that allow them to earn money that they need. They don't know what the future holds in terms of school. Everything is uncertain. And this might be seen again in all kinds of expressions of mood and emotion. They may be again spending a lot of time on their screens, and that of course is often a precipitator of punishment by parents. Parents really often resent the time that their children spend on screens and worry about it. They're often afraid of what that exposes them to. And so this can become a real flashpoint of conflict in homes with teenagers. Teens are also feeling a lack of privacy. They're in their homes with their families all day, every day. They've lost their independence, their ability to make their own choices. And so that can also be expressed in anger and increased time on social media. And they are also often feeling an undercurrent of resistance. They're resisting this confinement, particularly as it goes on and on. They might resist the constant presence of their parents, who at this age, they need to be separating from and forming their own identities and learning how to build their own intimate relationships and so on. And they're unable to do that. And the online and homeschooling can be very frustrating for teens. So this might be shown as a reluctance to do their schoolwork or even outright refusal, and floating physical distancing rules. So all of this, you can imagine, creates a lot of conflict in a lot of homes all around the world. And this is not an exhaustive picture by any means. These are a few brief examples of what's going on. But the main point is that what underlies the behavior is emotion. It's feelings, it's perceptions, it's the child's perspective on their world, their situation, that becomes expressed in their behavior. And on top of that, every child is an individual. So we can see a diversity, a range, a distribution along all kinds of dimensions of humanity. Things like our needs for physical activity. Some children are content to sit and read all day, and some children are really suffering because they can't be active. Some children need more social interaction than others. Some have a greater need for routine and regularity and predictability than others. Some have a greater need for novelty and change in their days than others. Some are more distractible than others, and some express their emotions more intensely than others. So all of that also feeds into this, because we often expect children to all behave in the same way and all react and to things in the same way, but they don't. Each one is an individual, just as adults are. So when we look at understanding how children think and feel, we look at sort of typical trajectories, but also the individualities of our children. And then what we do over a period of 8 weeks is we put all of this together so that parents can start to problem solve their conflicts, as opposed to reacting and punishing and responding impulsively. And what we encourage is, as children grow, to increasingly engage their children in that problem-solving process, so they increasingly become collaborators or participants in their own learning and in gaining skills in conflict resolution. And to help them do this, we help parents gain skills in self-regulation, the ability to not deny, control, or push down their own frustration and anger, but we try to build their skills in how to manage that so that they can respond constructively, so that they can express their own emotions and help their children learn how to do that in a way that doesn't damage relationships or impair mental health. And so we also help them learn how to co-regulate with their children so that their children are gaining those skills as well. And that is part of scaffolding or structure. So if we go back to what Ashley mentioned about the 5 principles of rights respecting discipline, we can see all of these present. And I'm just going to go quickly to the next slide that maps this on. So when we help parents identify their long-term goals, what are what kind of person are you hoping that this child will be, and what kind of relationship do you want to have with this child when they're all grown? What they say are things like nonviolence, respect, and resilience. So if we are helping them work toward those long-term goals, we are helping them operationalize children's rights. By providing warmth, we're respecting the child's dignity as opposed to shame and ignoring and inculcating fear. We're teaching the child that they are a person worthy of dignity and respect. By providing structure, we're respecting the child's evolving capacities. We're understanding their level of knowledge and skill and how they see the world, so that we're helping them scaffold and promote the evolution of their skills and understanding. By understanding how the child thinks and feels, we're respecting their individuality, their personhood, their perspective. We're validating that they have a view of the situation just as we do, and they are both right from that person's point of view. And then by problem solving rather than punishing, we're fostering the child's participation in their learning and in the conflict resolution process. By helping parents learn self-regulation and co-regulation, we're helping to ensure that their responses to their children are physically and emotionally nonviolent. So that is a quick outline of this approach, which is based on children's rights principles, and that is fundamentally grounded in the idea that the child is a full person. The child is a person with a valid viewpoint, and yet we need to also understand that they are, like we are, in a process of development and constant learning, and that we, as the adults, have the responsibility to become their mentors as opposed to instilling fear and threat and anxiety into their lives. We have a website if you're interested, which is www.positivedisciplineeveryday.com. And there we have uploaded a COVID-19 resource page. This is a screenshot of the beginning of that page. And there we have, and it's all accessible for free, you can access the parent book, a primer on this approach that explains in more detail, perhaps. Also an information kit that is specifically related to the COVID-19 situation. And that model that I just went through, we've put it up there as an interactive model so that you can click on any block and learn more, to read more and understand more. And all of those resources can be shared. And there's also a video that is narrated by me that, again, addresses rights respecting discipline within this pandemic context. And we're in the process of receiving a number of translations of this material as well, so those will be uploaded as we receive them. The key messages that we want to leave for parents are that all of us are feeling stress, frustration, and fear, both ourselves and our children. We're all in a heightened state of anxiety. And so we need to always keep in mind that what might look like bad behavior in the moment is really a sign of fear, stress, worry, and frustration, which it often is for us. That our bad behaviors that people might label for us as bad are also usually a sign of fear, stress, worry, and frustration. So by respecting children's rights to protection, dignity, and participation, we're going to strengthen our relationships, and we're going to build resilience during this crisis. I'm going to end here, and I have no idea what time it is, but I hope I've left some time for questions. But these are Ashley's and my email addresses, and also the email address of our organization, Positive Discipline in Everyday Life, a not-for-profit that coordinates this approach around the world. And you're welcome to contact us at any time. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing the questions.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Ashley, for sharing this information with us today. Are you both okay to stick around for a few minutes and answer some questions?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So we'll leave this slide up for a few minutes with their email addresses. We have lots of great questions. We probably won't get to all of them, but you are welcome to contact the presenters directly if we're not able to get to your question today. So I want to start off. We had a few questions related to implementing this child rights based framework for parenting with specific groups of kids. For example, children with disabilities or children who have ADHD. Can one of you speak to perhaps any modifications in the framework in those situations?
Now, that's a very interesting question, and I'll start with Ashley. Please elaborate.
Absolutely.
The viewpoint that we take is that all children are individuals. So children are all on a continuum of things like distractibility or attentional span. All of us are somewhere along that continuum. And so if we can figure out where we and our children are on those continua, then we're much more able to problem solve. So we don't set children apart into different sort of classifications. We help parents to understand every child as an individual. All children have different ways of processing information. Children have different abilities to process auditory information, visual information. They have different responses to touch and to different physical sensations. They have different levels of being distracted by things going on around them. So the way that we look at this is as every child is somewhere on every continuum in a unique way, just as we are. So we take parents through a rather elaborate activity where they think about themselves and where they sit on different continua, and then they think about their children, and then they see where they may be having conflicts and see the place for problem solving in that. And the model is the same no matter where people are on those dimensions. So we don't have like a special adaptation for children with ADHD, for example. They would be considered children like all children, and but we would look at our children's attentional issues and then take that into account when we're problem solving. Ashley, can you explain that any more clearly?
I'll just elaborate on that too. Like the program is inherently designed to really consider each person's individual gifts, strengths, and also our own challenges. So it's really about just celebrating the individual child and learning how to work with their gifts and learning how to support them through the challenges that they may have experienced. And it's really about appreciating individuality, appreciating differences that make our world so unique and wonderful. And it's about celebrating those and bolstering those as opposed to trying to get children to, fit into prescribed boxes, if you will. So, and it also, the way the program's designed is like, parents often come to the program with more than one child, and they often comment about how their children are so different. So we really help parents to understand that what an approach might work for one of your children may actually have the opposite effect for the other child. So it's about helping parents to to really understand what are their children's inherent gifts and strengths and use those to strengthen family relationships and work towards your long-term goals.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Um, we also had a series of questions from different people who perhaps are living in countries or work in countries where corporal punishment is perhaps legal or just accepted. And people are asking how to approach this framework or implement some of these things in those contexts.
Well, it's interesting that Ashley and I are both sitting in a country where corporal punishment is legal and largely accepted. So Canada still has not prohibited corporal punishment, which surprises many people. Um, so we also know that context. It may not be. It may manifest itself differently in different places. For example, the forms that it takes may be different in different places. But what we find is that the thinking that underlies it is very, very common around the world. So there are some countries where a cultural shift has really been made in helping people truly understand the detrimental effects of corporal punishment on children in so many ways. But in most of the world, it's still really deeply embedded. So this is really how this program came about, was to address that, to try to change that one step at a time. And to the one of the major obstacles to changing that is this belief that if you don't hit your child or punish your child, they're going to be spoiled, or they're going to become antisocial, or they're going to be selfish, or all those things. That it's a fear. Again, it's the fear that underlies behavior so often. So parents will often hit or hurt their children because they're afraid that if they don't, things will go awry. So they really need to deeply understand what children's learning is really all about. How do children actually internalize values, and how do they learn the things that we actually want them to learn? And once they understand that, they see how counterproductive hurting them is, and shaming them and humiliating them and all of that. They see that it's completely contrary to what they actually want to accomplish. And they really get it. And so what's happening in some places is that this approach is being scaled up at increasingly high levels, and in some places governments are implementing it as a means of shifting cultural norms. So the individual norms often reflect those even oftentimes invisible or unsaid cultural norms that are supported by law and by sometimes, well, in many cases, by religious interpretations and various things. So they get handed down across generations, and it's really, we see it as our job to help parents understand why that is so contrary to what they really want to accomplish in this parenting journey.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think we'll just ask one more. And again, I want to remind the audience that if your question is not asked today, we will make sure that the presenters get your questions and we get those answered as best we can. Ashley, in your presentation, you mentioned some emerging data on an increase in violent discipline. And I'm wondering if you have any information about specific countries where that's occurring, or if countries that where corporal punishment is not legal versus is legal, if there are differences there in emerging research that's coming out.
Yeah, thanks. And that's a great question. And I should have mentioned more of sort of the context around the research. And I actually was really pleasantly surprised to see how quickly a team was able to mobilize, conduct that type of study and get their findings out there. So that was a particular study that was conducted by Dr. Shauna Lee. She's, I believe, at American University. So she conducted this study using a sample of American parents And the study, the time frame was, I believe in April, so very recent. And these findings were just published like days ago. So she's sort of the leader in sort of sharing this increase in punitive violence during a pandemic. But there are other research teams that I know of, and even here at the University of Manitoba, there's researchers who are trying to conduct research to understand what parenting has been like during the pandemic, and both from the adult perspective and from the child perspective, because we hear anecdotally, we see stories in the news about increases, or rather decreases in reports to child protection agencies, but the cases that are presenting to, say, child protective services or emergency departments are more severe in nature. And so I think as we transition into this hopefully post-pandemic world, I think we're going to get a better sense of what parenting during the pandemic is like, and probably see more of an increase in punitive violence in other countries, not just in this one particular sample of American parents.
Okay, great. All right, thank you so much. I think we'll stop with the questions there. And I would like to thank the audience for all of your great questions, and to Joan and Ashley again for being with us today. And
Thank
just,
you.
yes, just to let you know, ISPCAN will be hosting more COVID-19 related webinars coming up. You can find information on our website on our COVID-19 resources page. There's a screenshot here, or at our website at ispcan.org. There, on this page, you can find resources for professionals across disciplines, as well as for parents and children. And this is some information about membership with ISPCAN. We encourage you to become a member if you're not already, so that we can continue having webinars like these. Our member benefits include discounts to our congresses, including our 2021 congresses in Italy and Australia. We offer several membership levels, including professional, student, emeritus, group membership, and associate membership, starting at $35 a year. And to learn more about ISPCAN, please visit us at ispcan.org. And a reminder that a recording and the slides will be available on our website shortly after this webinar. If you have any questions or comments, please contact us at resources@ispcan.org. And again, we will make sure your questions get to Joan and Ashley, and that those will be answered as best we can. So thank you all again for joining us today. Stay safe and stay healthy. And have a great day or night, depending on where you are. Thank you, everyone. Bye, Joan. Bye, Ashley.
Bye.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Heather.
much, everyone.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.